Good morning. We're here at Something to Talk About with the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. And this is sponsored by Fieldstone. And let's see, oh my gosh. Sponsored by Fieldstone Memory Care, Bainbridge Island. Fieldstone offers innovative and compassionate care, now accepting residents. Call 360-271-2530 to schedule a tour of Fieldstone's beautifully appointed apartments on Rolling Bay today. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Ann Lovejoy, and she's going to lead us on discovering the winter solstice and why do people celebrate it and how do they celebrate it. So hi, Ann.
Hey, Karen, thanks. To me, this has always been one of my favorite holidays, especially as I got less and less enchanted with the commercialization of winter holidays and felt the burdens of, that damn jolliness, right? I think for me, the winter is a time of sort of meditation and quiet. And one of the things I discovered, I've often read about the solstice over the years because in my family, my daughter and I especially love to celebrate solstice, and we would have bonfires, invite the neighbors over, and everybody would write down what they wanted to get rid of or what they were hoping for and throw them in the fire and make paper airplanes of their worst, nightmares and throw them in burn them all up. And then she would make mead, this honey mead that has been made for thousands of years. And traditionally, the more you toast with the mead, the rowdier and wilder the party gets, but we never quite got that carried away. But those were kind of wonderful celebrations. And here in our little mobile home park, we can't actually have a bonfire. So we have a little fire bowl and we kind of make do with that. But it's still, for me, a really lovely time of sort of darkness and light, release, letting go. One of the traditions that I love that's from a lot of the Nordic countries is to let the house be completely dark. And in some cases, they would extinguish every source of heat and light which meant it got really darn cold, right? And then at midnight, the youngest person would light a candle and then sing a song or offer a story or poem and then light someone else's candle. And they would in turn offer a song or story and pass the light around. And as the light grew, the thoughts, at first, a lot of times the stories would traditionally be pretty dark. About the darkness and the wild spirits of the winter and loss and loneliness and grief and sorrow. And then as the light grew and more people's candles were lit, the songs would get merrier and more joyful. And by the end, they were ready for a feast. And I thought that was an interesting tradition. And we tried to do that and we found out it's really hard to make a modern house completely dark. For one thing, there's about 1 million little teeny lights on everything. Our ground fault interrupters have a light, your internet has a light, I just ended up putting a blanket over the stove and a little bit of painter's tape on some of the most glaring of the lights. But it's kind of fascinating to see how we've sheltered ourselves from darkness. Mm-hmm. And darkness is now rare. There's so much light pollution. Even if your home is dark, the neighborhood probably isn't, right? But looking back at those old traditions, I was really sort of surprised to see that almost all of them actually were harvest traditions initially, signaling the end of harvest. Even in Japan and China, Iran, and all over the place, there these, and in fact, in Rome, the Roman traditional Saturnalia was to signal the end of harvest and the time to kick back. And those were some of the rowdiest celebrations. They grew from 1 or 2 days around the solstice to a whole week of revels, which included some interesting role playing and switching so that servants and slaves were made free for just a day, and the masters would serve the servants very, very briefly, but there was kind of an interesting reversal there that was a traditional part of that holiday, which I kind of loved, that sort of early looking at, what's fair and right? But I thought that was really intriguing. One of my favorite holiday traditions that I've celebrated myself for quite a while is in Japan on the solstice. Traditionally, you take a bath with yuzu fruit floating in the water. but yuzu fruit is kind of hard to come by and it's kind of expensive. So you can use satsumas and oranges, and sometimes we put in limes and grapefruit or whatever, but it kind of perfumes the water, which is really nice. And the cats totally love it. They get on the edge of the tub and they're bloop, 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 hitting those oranges. And it makes you just feel like it's a bath of renewal. It's meant to be good luck for the coming year. And one of the things that's kind of fascinating about the solstice is that it is the solar new year. And so for many, many tribes and many cultures around the world, solstice is the new year. They don't wait another week. They didn't care about the Julian calendar because it didn't exist, right? Well, this was the time that marked all the celebrations of renewal. But first, most of them made the plunge into the darkness. And that's something I personally really like to do. And I noticed this is not a culture that goes dark we can go dark in a brutal, ugly way, but it's harder to go dark in a reflective, meditative way. And I think it's something we could really spend a little time on. Here, and I see you're nodding. Do you have?
Yes, absolutely. It's, you know, I look around my new neighborhood and there's lights everywhere.
Yeah.
Backyard dilemma city officials across the country face when trying to decide.
Let's see. I hear noise.
Could
somebody mute themselves? Let's see.
24/7 supervised.
I think that might be Richard.
There we go. I muted him. So
Yeah,
we're
thanks.
good. We're good.
Yeah, we don't
So-
need the radio.
No.
So generally speaking, if somebody would like to make a comment, I'd love for you to jump in with a question or a comment or a thought, because that's what makes these conversations so lively, right? So,
Well, one thing I wanted to say is that we went to Yule Fest this year.
Mhm.
And, you know, I had heard of it, but, you know, now we're living in Hallsville. I decided let's go. And we didn't do, you know, the food part and all. We just wanted to see the boat come in with Lucia on it and the bonfire and all of that. But it was just fascinating. I mean, they were in their Nordic Viking clothing, and they did a procession with the torches and bringing in Santa Lucia on the Viking boat, and then the amazing bonfire.
Mm.
It was just amazing. I hadn't seen a bonfire in so many years. And I think it's because, you know, we were always afraid it was so dry and everybody is afraid to catch things on fire. But it was really quite stunning to see. And also the proclamation of the solstice that the lead Viking did, and talking about the lightness coming from the darkness into the light. And that was, you know, wow. You know, if you ever get a chance, check out the Paulsbo calendar. It was a week before solstice, because solstice is officially tomorrow, I believe.
Mhm.
Yes, it is tomorrow.
Okay, yeah, the 21st.
It shifts around a little bit, but yeah, and I've been to something similar to that in Denmark many years ago, and a lot of the Scandinavian countries still celebrate Yule. And actually, Christmas was moved to be at this time of year specifically to try to override the Yule celebrations, which were pagan holidays, and the Christian church wanted to kind of smother as many of those as possible. So they, interestingly, like almost many of the major festivals of the Christian church are actually specifically shifted to try to interrupt some older tradition. And that's a tough one to interrupt, because it was a 2-month celebration in a lot of Scandinavian countries and Nordic countries. And a lot of the same traditions have been handed down and just absorbed by Christmas. And they were things like candles on trees. It's a really ancient symbol. Even making trees and decorating them, or not, kind of decorating them with food for birds, putting out sheaves of oats and stringing apples and putting them out for birds and stuff. That's an ancient, like several thousand years old tradition in a lot of northern countries. So like sharing the harvest, right?
Mhm.
You're totally correct. And though I haven't been there yet, hopefully next year I'll go to Wales and Ireland for the events in December. They must be fantastic also.
Well, you have some of them have a lottery, so that there's like,
Yeah.
I think they said 6,000 people applied for a position to be able to watch the sunrise on the solstice, and they only let in like 50 or something. But obviously that's been going on for thousands of years, because some of those sites are at least 2,000 or 3,000 years old.
Oh, you thought like Stonehenge?
Yeah,
Oh,
like
yes.
Stonehenge,
Yeah,
but there's other
Stonehenge.
ones too. Those were ancient astronomical calendars, essentially. And
Yeah.
the Incas have them too.
I'm glad you said that.
Have
I'm
them.
glad you said that about the Incas, because that's another one of my goals, to go there for their festivals.
Mhm.
Fantastic. So
I think
thank you.
fewer people realize that actually solstice was recognized even in what is now America. Those traditions were being celebrated thousands and thousands of years by Zuni people and Hopi people.
Definitely.
Soya was the winter solstice of the Hopi people in Arizona, and they would do purification and dancing and call in the Kachina protective spirits from the mountains and do make prayer sticks and do blessings. That tradition is thousands of years old. And also the Zuni people, in the Pueblo people, had that Shalako, which was a similar kind of thing. Christmas is that it was chosen to be December 25th, because if you were not one of those people who was around a place with a solar calendar like Stonehenge, the 25th of December is the first day that was actually possible to tell that the light has shifted, that the days are getting a little bit longer. Because for the first few days, it's only a matter of seconds, but by then it's like a little over a minute. And if you have even a very basic solar calendar set up, you can see the difference by December 25th, because it didn't really have anything to do with whenever the birth of Jesus was. Nobody really knows, right? People all over the world have figured out how to celebrate what's happening as the year shifts, right? That these are very important points. So the equinoxes and the solstices are the 4 seasonal shifts on the solar calendar. And those were all recognized all over the world by pretty much every culture. I love the tropics tradition around the equator. On the solstices, they're called the Day of No Shadow, because the sun is directly overhead. And so it's sort of a big festival of no shadow, which I think is spiritually fascinating, right? It's like, what if we had no shadow? What if we carried nothing?
Yeah. I was on the equator in Kenya and Tanzania. And what you're saying is I flip it and say it a little bit different. I think it's fantastic now that Western society and American society is acknowledging the fact that the history and traditions of the people that the Europeans and the Americans conquered are so incredibly fantastic. And those are the histories, traditions, and holidays that have been celebrated for eons versus ours that have been celebrated for less than 2,000 years, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and of course, the holidays, the Christmas particularly picked up a lot of baggage in the Victorian period in England.
Yeah.
When Queen Victoria, of course, her family was German, and so they adopted a lot of the Germanic Yule traditions, and she was the first to bring in Christmas trees and decorate the trees. Before that, even in England and through most of Europe, Christmas was a day to go to church, not to do much else. It wasn't about, and there were, again, the solstice was the feasting day. The solstice was the day to hold Yule and bring in the Yule Log. That was a tradition for thousands of years too. But Christmas was a religious holiday, not a commercial holiday. And one of the kind of fun traditions that a lot of the Scandinavian countries have is similar to Halloween, in that there are longstanding traditions of people dressing up in really scary costumes to be trolls and dark spirits and running around, and they used to spray goat blood on people. These days it's usually not done. And it's supposed to be chasing away demons, but then it sort of morphed into scaring children that if they weren't good, your parents would feed you to the demons, right? And in some countries, the doorways on the solstice would be coated with butter as a gift to the fertility and harvest goddesses, which seems like that would smell really funky, but maybe not until summer, right?
Well, maybe not on the first day funky, but certainly by the fourth.
Well, if it's freezing cold, my friend Les up in Alaska talked about having, there hasn't been a day over zero in over a month. And the nights, of course, are way below zero. He said the high the other day was 16 below. And so he makes an ice garden in his, and actually opens it for the solstice he makes beautiful flowers out of ice and food coloring, and then lights them. He said he used to use battery powered candles, but the batteries won't always work when it's really, really cold. So he uses candles and has to get hundreds of them. And I'm going to show you this. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So that's one of his constructions. And he makes screens, and then you can see the flowers go off into the back. And so he celebrates the light blooming in his winter garden. And it's a big deal up in Willow, Alaska. There's not a lot going on at that time of year. And people come from all over the place, and he gets donations for the library. So it's actually single-handedly doubled what the holdings of the of the Willow, Alaska Library. But in those places, you know, light days are really, really short and very, very dark. And so, of course, the dark stories, the darker traditions are part of that celebration in a way that I feel like we're missing. You know, our culture is kind of a light chaser culture, and we want to be up, we want to be positive, we want to be bubbly. All those things are great. But I think if we're not in balance, we're really missing out on an important piece of human development. Barbara, speak up.
Yeah, my son and I traveled to England and Scotland, and he was actually turned 13 when we were there, and we were in Edinburgh for the Hogmanay celebration, which he just thought was the most incredible thing. So they have a small wooden boat, and they have torches in it, and they bring it down the windy street near the castle. And that was just a wonderful, the whole city turned out. It was really celebratory and exciting.
For a lot of people, these holidays had been kind of lost to tradition, but it's really fascinating to me that in the last few decades, there are neo-pagan movements that are gaining speed, and it's people who are tired of organized religion, who are looking to ancient traditions to try to find spiritual comfort and solace and strength. And then also the Wiccan movement, which I had always thought meant sort of good witches, but apparently it's wider than that, and also very much tied to the Celtic traditions, which of course had major celebrations on equinoctial days and solstice days. And so that both Wiccan and neo-paganism is actually spreading quite rapidly. I think it's fascinating. Here in the Northwest, Washington State is one of the least churched states in the entire country. And in fact, the whole sort of Pacific Northwest is kind of not as churched as some parts of the country are. And so this is one of the places where these traditions are starting to be reborn. And as Karen pointed out, you know, we can go to Paulsbo and get a pretty good glimpse of some of the cleaned up revels.
Well,
Speaking of rebels,
Yeah, Eleanor.
That's in my family, we've celebrated the solstice and the beginning of the season by participating and or attending revels performances, first in DC and just this last weekend in Tacoma, the Puget Sound Revels, which by the way, this year is a Quebecois play. And you know, so welcome Yule has been a long-standing phrase in the family.
What is revels? How do you spell that word?
REVELS, revels.
Oh, revels. Okay.
As in reveling, which is, you know, essentially what it is. It's a performance that started actually in Massachusetts eons ago. And it's a performance, it sometimes includes a little bit of Christmas or Father Christmas, at least, although it's not it's rather an intentionally not religious performance, and it brings in There's a theme every year that brings in the traditions and song, music and dance and poetry and stories of different places.
And the revel tradition is really ancient as well.
Yeah.
I mean, literally thousands and thousands of years. In the Elizabethan court days, the revels, the high revels, took weeks and started, before the solstice and continued till after Epiphany. And again, those religious holidays weren't considered to be revels at all. So the reveling didn't happen so much on whatever days were like Christmas and Epiphany, but they were the end of revels, or they were a break in the revels. But usually it meant music and dance and theater of some kind, often dressing up, costuming, sometimes exchange of gifts. In the Celtic traditions, often there was actually Druidic traditions of reveling that involved, mistletoe and sort of more mystic. And some of them were pretty bloody, some of those rituals, and they've been, of course, hopefully left behind. But mistletoe was considered to be a sacred plant, sacred to the solstice, partly because it's a parasite, which I thought was interesting. It's like, because it doesn't grow in the ground and it doesn't have roots in the soil, it was considered to be sort of the spirit world and not.
Well, and it grows particularly on oak trees, and it's green all winter.
Yep. And apple trees. We actually have a mistletoe that parasite that feasts particularly well on Douglas firs. It's not as attractive, it's not as big, but quite a chunk of it around on the island. But yeah, it's great. Go ahead, Eleanor.
Oh, I was just going to say, well, just to get a little bit out of my tortured time there, mistletoe is the state flower of Oklahoma.
Oh.
And I was inclined to say, well, what can you expect from a state where the flower is a parasite? Which actually it isn't. It's something else I've forgotten. One of my friends in biology corrected me, but I promptly forgot what he said.
Saprophytic.
But it grows there prolifically. And I knew people who used to make Christmas money by going out and gathering mistletoe to sell.
We watched a show on a chef who was returning to her home in the Carolinas. And that was one of the traditions in the Carolinas. They shot the mistletoe down. That was pretty crazy. I hadn't seen, that was new to me, new to us. Yeah.
Well, I guess, back in the day, that was the only way to get them down. Some of these trees are pretty darn big, especially the oaks, and even the apple trees can be really quite large, 60 feet. So, it's no small feat to climb up there and get the mistletoe.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Wow.
yes, several members of my relatives back in the day were known as mistletoe sharpshooters. I thought it was fun.
Has anybody besides me attended the summer solstice festivities in Fremont area of Seattle? The parade and the
Yes.
events there. You have?
Oh, yeah.
More than once?
Well, I used to live in Seattle, so we would do that kind of stuff every year. Yeah, and the music traditions, the revels in Seattle are still, I think, going. That you could have groups of carolers who weren't singing so much Christmas carols as Yuletide carols, who would go around Seattle neighborhoods and sing. That was kind of a longstanding tradition. I'm not sure it's still going, but maybe. I think rather than protecting ourselves from the dark, it's like befriending the dark and being able to sit with it. And I think that's the real value of some of those longstanding traditions of extinguishing all light and being cold and dark for a while and sitting with that and feeling the edge of it, I guess. Recently, we held a death cafe at the senior center, and we're going to have another one. And I think we're going to have a climate change cafe in February, I believe, as well. But it's a time to sit with some of those big kind of topics that we consider to be dark or difficult, and hear from other people and exchange just ideas and thoughts and feelings about them. There's no right or wrong. There's no big answers. There's no test. But I think the big idea is that it opens us to deeper development.
If you're looking at the darkness and you're reflective, you might not want to go out and spend money frivolously. So you always have to see the light. And so, always have to be, and it's like, yeah, I also think that's a ploy, to be quite honest with you.
Well,
So-
it is. And, that tradition is really fairly recent. Barbara?
Yeah,
Well-
this is not exactly holiday related, but it came to mind now. There's a podcast called On Being by Krista Tippett, Krista And one of the guests that I found most interesting was a British author named Catherine May, and that's Catherine with a C. And she wrote a book called Wintering.
Mhm.
And it actually has to do more with like depression than winter and solstice, but it's a way to go inside yourself when you need to examine those issues that are not light and warm, that are challenging. And it's just a really fascinating conversation I would recommend.
And
Great.
tell about bringing the Yule log in. I mean, I know I've heard the term Yule log forever, but I don't exactly know the beginnings of that.
Well, part of it was that, if you think back in the olden days when people were living in giant, there would be a manor house. I mean, a lot of people were living in hovels, let's be clear.
Yeah.
But even there, you'd cut the biggest log you could and drag it in, and it would burn for the whole of the solstice period. So it's supposed to be burned at least 2 days and a night or 2 days and 2 nights. But in the big baronial halls, they would actually cut a huge tree and then haul it in with horses.
Wow.
And, I know, right? And then all kinds of people and they would decorate the log with swags of evergreens and things like that. And then putting the log in place and starting that fire, that was to celebrate the new solar year.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the
Okay.
longer it burned, the luckier it was.
Okay.
So you
Okay,
would want
that's
the biggest log you could find, right? And of course, some of those fireplaces you could walk in.
You
Right.
could,
Yeah.
you could, yeah. Mhm.
I have a vivid memory of a fireplace that a car could fit in, where a big tree burned for several days. And this is the first time I've thought about it in 50 years.
When I lived in Italy for a few years, that was a really interesting experience because they celebrate Christmas again as it's a religious holiday, not really, not much about gifts or anything like that. But one year when I was there with some other American girls in an apartment, we decided we wanted a tree. So some friends of ours who were from Somalia and had a car, and we went out to the country, and somebody had a farm, and they said we could come and cut a tree on their farm. So we found a little tree and cut it and brought it back and sort of set it up in this little apartment and made paper ornaments for it and stuff. And some people had made presents and put it under the tree. And we put decorations on the tree out of paper mostly. And these friends of ours were sort of watching this whole thing in a mild astonishment and said, "So you worship the tree because you give it presents, and you sing to it, and you dress it all up. What does that represent to you?" And I thought, good point. What does that represent?
Oh,
Well, one could do worse than worship trees.
Well,
Yes,
I kind of
yes.
think I do worship trees to some
Yeah.
extent, or at least I admire the life and love in them, right? One thing I'd say too, to end us off here, is that even in these dark days, there is light. And so to take a walk and get as much sun as you can, even if you're out for 15 or 20 minutes, can definitely elevate your mood better than really anything else. And so making sure that you do get out a little bit every day, I think is one of the healthiest ways to, recognize winter, right? And help ourselves to a little more light.